The morning Walter Grayson rode up to the fence line and told Clara Bennett she had until sundown to clear her belongings off his ranch. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She pressed her boots into the soil her father had broken with his bare hands 20 years before, looked Walter dead in the eye, and said, "You can have the paper, but this land knows who belongs to it." He laughed. She let him. Because Clara Bennett had already decided she wasn't going anywhere. If this story moves you, friends, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Wyoming Territory, 1886. Clara Bennett had been awake since before the roosters. She always was. There was no one else to be awake. No foreman, no hired hand who stayed past payday. No family left to call her name through the dark of the house. Just Clara, the lantern she lit at 4 in the morning, and the work that was always waiting. She moved through the barn the way a woman moves through a place she has loved for so long that her body remembers every board, every shadow, every animal sound, before her mind has even caught up. She knew which of the mares favored her left foreleg, by the way. Her weight shifted in the stall. She knew which fence post on the north line had been leaning 3 degrees further west since the last hard rain, and she'd already cut the wire and reset the post before most men in Harlan County had poured their first cup of coffee. That was the thing about Clara Bennett. She wasn't remarkable in any way that the town of Harlan seemed capable of recognizing. She wasn't tall. She wasn't loud. She didn't carry a gun on her hip or ride into town with the kind of authority that made people step aside. She was a woman of 27, with calloused hands and a set jaw and eyes the color of creek water in autumn. Gray-green and very still, the kind of eyes that took in more than they gave back. What she was, quietly and completely, was the reason the Bennett Ranch still stood. 7 years had passed since her father, Thomas Bennett, had died. 7 years since a man named Walter Grayson had walked into the county courthouse with a document in his hand and a lawyer at his side, and told the judge that Thomas Bennett had signed over the deed to the property before his death to settle an outstanding debt. 7 years since Clara had stood in that same courthouse, young and stunned and dressed in black mourning clothes that still smelled faintly of the cedar chest, and tried to explain that her father would never have done that he had never mentioned any debt, that the signature on the document looked almost like her father's, but not quite right in the way a person's own handwriting can sometimes look when someone else is trying to imitate it. The judge had been polite about it. He had told her he understood this was a difficult time. He had told her that grief sometimes made people question things that were not, in fact, in question. And then he had ruled in Walter Grayson's favor. Clara had walked out of that courthouse into the Wyoming sun and stood on the boardwalk for a long moment, not quite able to make her feet move in any direction. She had no money for an appeal. She had no influential family. Her mother had died when Clara was 9, and her father had been an only son from a line of men who believed in hard work over connections. She had no one standing behind her. What she had was the ranch. Not legally, not on paper, but in every way that a person can belong to a place. In the muscle memory of it, in the knowledge of where the water table ran shallowest in August, and where the soil held warmth longest in November, and which horses needed which kind of handling. Clara Bennett belonged to that ranch completely, and so she had made a decision that people, if they had understood it, might have called foolish. She stayed. Walter Grayson had expected her to leave. Most people assumed she would. A young woman alone, no legal claim, no money. The sensible thing would have been to find a position in town, maybe take in sewing, or teach at the schoolhouse, or find a man willing to overlook the fact that she'd come from a family that had apparently died in debt. But Clara had looked at the horses and the fields and the fence lines her father had built with his own hands, and she had understood something with a cold, quiet clarity that settled in her chest like a stone. If she left, Walter would ruin it within a year. I didn't know the land. He didn't know the animals. He didn't know that the north pasture flooded in spring and had to be managed carefully, or you'd lose half the grazing season. He didn't know that old Josephine, the lead mare, needed a specific kind of patience that most men didn't have. He didn't know any of it. but he was smart enough to know that Clara did. And so Walter Grayson had made his own arrangement. He allowed Clara to stay on the property, in the small back room that had once been the hired hand's quarters, in exchange for her labor. He paid her almost nothing, enough for soap and thread and the occasional trip to the dry goods store, but not enough to save, not enough to build anything, not enough to matter. He called her the caretaker when people asked. He introduced her, on the rare occasions he bothered to introduce her at all, as the Bennett girl helps keep things running. And the town of Harlan had accepted that without question, because that was the kind of town it was. The kind of town that is very good at not seeing what it isn't looking for. Clara had learned to live inside that invisibility. She had learned to keep her face still when Walter rode through on his occasional visits to check on his investment, when he walked the barn with his thumbs hooked in his vest and made comments about the horses as though he understood them. She had learned to answer his questions in flat, direct sentences and to wait until he'd ridden back down the road before she let herself feel anything about it. She had learned to keep records. That was something her father had taught her. Thomas Bennett had been a careful man, a man who wrote things down not because he distrusted people, but because he believed that truth deserved a paper trail. He'd kept ledgers on everything: feed costs, breeding records, rainfall measurements, the condition of equipment, the dates of every transaction, large and small. After his death, Walter had taken the official ranch ledgers as part of the property. What he hadn't known was that Clara had been keeping a second set since she was 15 years old. Her father had taught her as part of her education, making her copy the figures each week into her own journal as a way of learning ranch accounting. Those journals were hers. They had always been hers. And they were hidden in a place Walter Grayson had never thought to look. She had added to them every week for 7 years. Every transaction Walter made. Every sale he recorded. Every profit he claimed. Every decision about the ranch that Clara had quietly corrected before it became a disaster. All of it, written in her careful hand, with dates and amounts and the names of buyers and sellers. She didn't know what she was going to do with it yet, but she kept writing. Because her father had taught her that truth deserved a paper trail. The morning Nathan Cole rode through the gate was a Tuesday in early September, and Clara was on her knees in the dirt next to the south water trough, her arm buried to the elbow in the drainage pipe, trying to clear a blockage that was going to cost her the better part of the morning. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. A good horse, she could tell by the sound. Confident footfall, no nervousness, well shod. She pulled her arm out of the pipe, wiped it on the side of her trousers, and stood up. The man who rode through her gate was somewhere in his early 30s, lean the way men who work outdoors go lean. Not thin, but condensed, like everything unnecessary had been burned away by years of hard weather and harder work. He wore a dark brown hat that had seen some miles, and he sat his horse the way a person sits in a chair they've spent so long in that they've shaped it to themselves. He pulled up about 10 yards from her and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "I'm looking for the owner of this property. I'm told you've got horses for sale." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Who told you that?" she asked. "Man at the livery in town," he said. "Said the Bennett Ranch had some of the best quarter horses in the county." "He's right," Clara said. "What kind of horse are you looking for?" The man tilted his head slightly. He had dark eyes, watchful, the kind that moved around a space the way a person moves through it when they're assessing it for information rather than admiration. "Working horse," he said. "Strong, steady, not prone to spooking. I ride long distances, and I need something that can hold up." "Come with me," Clara said. She led him to the main horse barn without another word, and he followed, dismounting and leading his own horse behind him with the ease of a man who is very comfortable in barns. Clara noticed he glanced around as they walked, not the way visitors usually did, not admiring, but cataloging. She took him to the third stall on the left, where a 4-year-old sorrel gelding stood watching them approach with calm, intelligent eyes. "This one," Clara said. "He's got the best temperament of anything we've raised in 3 years. 16 hands, sound feet, good lungs." He covered 60 miles last fall in 2 days during the cattle drive and came back without a scratch. The man stepped into the stall quietly, ran his hands along the horse's neck and back, checked the hooves, looked at the teeth. He did it the way a person does who actually knows what they're looking at. "How do you know about the cattle drive?" he asked, without looking up. "I was there," Clara said. Now he looked up. "You were on the cattle drive?" "I organized the cattle drive," Clara said. "I pick the horses, train the horses, and manage the breeding program. I do the accounts and the scheduling and the negotiations with buyers." She paused. "Mr. Grayson signs the documents." The man was quiet for a moment. He straightened up, turned to look at her fully, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity, not surprise exactly, but a kind of careful attention, the look of a man rearranging what he thought he understood. "Nathan Cole," he said, and extended his hand. Clara shook it. Clara Bennett. Something moved across his face at that name. Not recognition, but something close to it. The slight narrowing of a person who has heard a piece of information and is deciding what to do with it. "Bennett," he said. "Same as the ranch." "My father built it," Clara said. 22 years ago. Started with 40 acres and a horse he'd won in a card game." "And now?" Nathan asked. Clara's jaw set in that particular way it did when she was keeping something in. "Now it belongs to Mr. Grayson," she said, "legally speaking." Nathan Cole didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the horse. He looked at the barn. He looked at the neat rows of equipment hung on the wall, every tool in its place, every piece of tack clean and properly stored. Then he looked at Clara. "This doesn't look like a man's barn," he said quietly. "A man who doesn't know what he's doing. His barn looks different. Things are left wrong. Animals aren't quite right. Something's always slightly off." He looked around again. "This place is being managed by someone who knows exactly what they're doing." Clara didn't answer. "You said your father built this," Nathan said. "He did." "And you've been running it?" "I've been working here," Clara said carefully, "since before my father passed." "How long since he passed?" 7 years. Nathan nodded slowly. "And in those 7 years," he said, "who made the decisions about which horses to breed, which pastures to rotate, when to buy and when to sell?" Clara looked at him steadily. "I did," she said. "Then why?" Nathan said, his voice very calm and very even. "Isn't your name on any of this?" It was such a simple question. She'd been asked harder questions. She'd been asked why she stayed, why she hadn't fought harder, why she kept working for a man who'd stolen from her. Those questions she knew how to answer, or at least how to deflect. This one caught her somewhere unguarded. She didn't answer right away. And Nathan Cole, to his credit, didn't try to fill the silence. He just waited, with the patience of a man who has learned that silence is sometimes the most respectful thing you can offer someone. "Because," Clara finally said, "in 1879, the law in this county didn't require a man to have any other reason than a piece of paper." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me about your father's death." Nobody had asked her that in 7 years. Not as a question that wanted the real answer. She told him. She told him about how her father had been sick for only 3 weeks. A fast, hard sickness that had surprised everyone, because Thomas Bennett had been the kind of man who seemed like he might outlast the mountains. She told him about the document Walter had produced, and the lawyer, and the courthouse, and the judge who had been kind and wrong. She told him about the second set of ledgers she'd been keeping since she was 15. She told him about the 7 years of staying and working and waiting and writing things down. She told him more than she had told anyone. And when she was done, Nathan Cole was quiet for a long time. "The ledgers," he said finally. "You still have them?" "Every one," Clara said. "All the way back to before your father died?" "Back to 1874, Clara said. Nathan looked at her with an expression she didn't immediately know how to name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was something more direct than either of those things. A kind of recognition, The way a person looks at something they've been searching for without quite knowing what they were searching for. "Miss Bennet," he said, "I came here to buy a horse." "I know," Clara said. "But I think," Nathan said slowly, "that a horse might be the least important thing that happens here today." Clara studied him. She had learned, over 7 years, to be very careful about men who wanted to help her. They usually wanted something. They usually underestimated what they were stepping into. They usually disappeared when Walter Grayson turned his full attention in their direction. Because Walter Grayson was a man with money and connections, and the easy authority of someone who had never had to justify himself to anyone. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I appreciate what you're suggesting, but I've been down this road before. People get interested in my situation, and then they understand the full picture and they move on. I don't blame them. Walter Grayson has friends in this county. He has a lawyer who's won cases that had no business being won. He has the kind of quiet influence that makes men think twice before they put themselves in his path." "I'm sure that's true," Nathan said. "So I want you to understand," Clara continued, "before you say anything else. I am not a charity case. I am not a woman waiting to be saved. I have been managing this situation for 7 years with a plan and a purpose, and I don't want to save you," Nathan said. She stopped. "I want to know," he said, his voice entirely level, "whether the evidence you've been collecting for 7 years is the kind that could actually hold up in front of a judge. Because I've seen this before. Not here. Further south, in New Mexico territory, a family lost their land the same way. Forged documents, a cooperative lawyer, a county judge who couldn't see past the paper in front of him." He paused. "That family never got their land back. They ran out of time before they ran out of reasons." Clara was very still. "I'm not a lawyer," Nathan continued. "I'm not a lawman. I'm a man who spent 3 years working with a land surveyor in New Mexico and knows what fraudulent documentation looks like when it's laid next to honest records." "You worked with a land surveyor," Clara repeated. "For 3 years," Nathan said. "Before that, I worked 2 years for a county clerk in Arizona. Before that, I was driving cattle like every other young fool who thought that was a life." A slight tilt at the corner of his mouth. It isn't, for the record." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you in Wyoming?" she asked. "Looking for work," Nathan said, "and apparently looking for a horse." "The sorrel's $300, Clara said. Nathan blinked. "That's a fair price," he said carefully. "It's an honest price," Clara said. "Same as everything else I do." He held her gaze. "Miss Bennet," he said, "will you show me the ledgers?" The pause that followed was the kind that has weight to it, that you feel in the chest. In 7 years, Clara had shown those ledgers to no one. They were her evidence, and her safety, and her secret all at once. Her record of everything. The paper trail of a truth that nobody else had thought to keep. To show them to a stranger was to make herself vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed since the day she'd walked out of that courthouse. But she looked at Nathan Cole. His steady eyes, his quiet hands. The way he'd stood in that stall and seen the horse clearly, and asked questions that cut straight to the thing that mattered. And she weighed it. "Come with me," she said. She led him across the yard to the small back room she'd lived in for 7 years. The former hired hand's quarters, spare and neat. The way a life is when every object in it has to earn its place. She went to the floorboard in the far corner, the one that looked like all the others, but lifted out in a way that the others didn't. And she pulled out a wooden box she'd built herself from scrap lumber the first winter after her father died. Inside were 14 journals, 14 years of numbers and dates and names and transactions, in Clara Bennett's careful, precise handwriting. She set them on the table and stepped back. Nathan sat down and opened the first one. I didn't speak for a long time. He read the way people read when they're actually reading, slowly, going back, checking figures, cross-referencing. Clara stood and watched him, and felt something in the back of her throat that she couldn't quite name. Something that might have been, after 7 years, the beginning of something like hope. After nearly an hour, Nathan looked up. His face was serious. "Miss Bennet," he said, Do you know the name Samuel Whitaker? Clara shook her head. He's a lawyer, Nathan said. He practices out of Cheyenne. He's spent the last several years taking on land fraud cases in the territory. He paused. He's won most of them. Clara's hands were very still on the edge of the table. These records, Nathan said, his voice careful and measured, are the most complete documentation of ranch operations I've ever seen in my time doing this work. If they're accurate, Clara said quietly. Then they don't just support your claim to this property, Nathan said. They contradict, specifically and in detail, the account that Walter Grayson gave to the court in 1879. Clara felt the words land somewhere deep. But there's something else, Nathan said. He turned back a few pages, pointed to a column of figures. These transactions here, the timber sales in 82 and 83. Do you know who the buyer was? Clara leaned over to look. A company called Caldwell Territories Limited, she said. I never met anyone from the company directly. Walter handled those negotiations. Nathan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Thomas Caldwell, he said quietly. You know him? I know of him, Nathan said. He's a banker based in Laramie. He's been involved in 3 separate land acquisition cases in the last 5 years that I know of. Always the same pattern. A death, a debt, a document that appears legitimate. He paused. Miss Bennett, I don't think Walter Grayson acted alone. The room was very quiet. Outside, a horse moved in its stall. The wind pushed against the side of the building. Clara stood at the table and felt the world she'd been living in for 7 years shift on its foundations, like a structure that had always had a crack in it, and someone had finally found where the crack ran. How many other families? She asked. Nathan's face answered before his voice did. At least 4 that I know of, he said. Probably more. Clara was silent for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, My father used to say that a wrong done in the dark doesn't disappear. It just waits. Nathan looked at her. He was right, he said. He was usually right, Clara said. And her voice was steady, and her hands were steady, and the 14 journals sat on the table between them, like the accumulated weight of a truth that had been waiting 7 years for someone willing to help carry it into the light. Outside, the September sun moved across the Wyoming sky, and inside that small, spare room, 2 people sat across from each other and understood, without either of them saying it out loud, that something had just changed. Clara Bennett reached out and straightened the edge of the top journal. I'll need to know more about Samuel Whitaker, she said. I figured you would, Nathan said. And I'll need to know, she said, whether you're the kind of man who's still here in 2 weeks when Walter Grayson finds out someone's been asking questions. Nathan looked at her steadily. I'm the kind of man, he said, who came here for a horse and found something worth a great deal more than that. Clara held his gaze. That's not an answer to my question, she said. Nathan almost smiled. No, he said. I'm still here in 2 weeks. Clara looked at the journals. Then she looked at the man across the table. All right, Mr. Cole, she said. Let's talk about Walter Grayson. Nathan Cole stayed for supper that night. Clara hadn't invited him exactly. She'd simply kept talking, and he'd kept listening, and by the time they'd worked through the 3rd journal together, the light outside had shifted to the low amber of early evening, and neither of them had noticed until Clara's stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten since before dawn. She'd made biscuits and salt pork and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and they'd eaten at the same small table with the journals spread between them, and she'd thought distantly that it was the first meal she'd shared with another person in longer than she could easily remember. Tell me about the debt, Nathan said, reaching for another biscuit. The one Walter claimed your father owed him. According to the document, Clara said, my father borrowed $3,000 from Walter in 1876 to cover a bad season. Cattle prices dropped that year. That part is true. It was a hard year for everyone. But my father never borrowed money he couldn't account for. She tapped the journal from 1876. Look at that year. Every dollar in and every dollar out. There's no loan payment, no ledger entry for borrowed funds, no interest payment, nothing. Nathan looked at the page she indicated. A man who keeps records this carefully doesn't forget to write down a $3,000 loan. No, Clara said. He doesn't. Did your father know Walter well? They grew up in the same county in Missouri, Clara said. Walter came west a few years after my father did. They'd partnered on a cattle purchase in '73. That's in the ledger too. Everything properly accounted for. Profits split down the middle the way my father said they agreed. After that they were friendly. My father trusted him. She paused. My father trusted most people. He thought it was the decent way to live. Nathan was quiet for a moment. And the lawyer Walter used at the courthouse. Do you know his name? Harlan, Clara said. Theodore Harlan. He practices out of the same office he's always used, 3 blocks from the courthouse. He's never been disbarred, never been formally questioned, never had a single complaint filed against him that went anywhere. She looked at Nathan steadily. And he and Judge Alderson have been fishing together every summer for 20 years. Nathan set down his biscuit. You know all of this, he said. Not a question. A recognition. I've had 7 years to learn this county, Clara said. I know who owes favors to whom. I know which men drink together, and which men do business together, and which men look the other way, for which other men. She folded her hands on the table. What I've never had is someone willing to stand up in the same room as all of it. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Miss Bennett, he said, I want to ride into Harlan tomorrow and send a wire to Samuel Whitaker in Cheyenne. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated than fear. The particular tension of a person who has wanted something for so long that wanting it has become a way of surviving. And now that it might actually be within reach, the wanting has become almost unbearable. Walter has people in Harlan, she said. Men who keep their eyes open for him. If a stranger starts sending wires asking about land records, then Walter will know someone is looking, Nathan said. Yes, that's a risk. He met her eyes. Miss Bennett, 7 years of careful waiting has gotten you exactly this far. At some point, you have to be willing to let people know you're still in the fight. The words settled over the room. Clara looked at the journals on the table. 14 years of her life in those pages. 14 years of writing down the truth in a small room while the world outside decided to believe a lie. All right, she said quietly. Send the wire. Nathan Cole rode into Harlan the next morning before 8 o'clock, and Clara stayed at the ranch and did what she always did. Fed the horses, checked the fence lines, reviewed the accounts, and tried not to think too hard about what was happening in town. She was in the middle of examining a broodmare's hoof when she heard a second horse come through the gate. She set the hoof down and straightened up slowly. Walter Grayson dismounted with the easy confidence of a man who has never questioned his right to be anywhere. He was 53 years old, heavy through the middle the way prosperous men get when prosperity is the only thing they've had to work for in a long time, with a silver watch chain across his vest, and the kind of smile that didn't reach far enough up his face to matter. Clara, he said. Not Miss Bennett. Never Miss Bennett. Just Clara, the way you'd call a dog that had learned to stay close. Mr. Grayson, she said, I hear you had a visitor yesterday. He looked around the yard the way he always did when he came, assessing, calculating, checking whether anything had changed without his permission. A stranger asking about horses. Clara kept her voice even. Man came looking to buy a working horse. I showed him what we had. Did he buy? He's considering. Walter's smile didn't shift. What's his name? Cole, Clara said. Nathan Cole. Walter repeated the name slowly, like he was rolling it around to see whether it had any weight to it. Where's he from? Didn't say. What else did you two talk about? Clara looked at him. Horses, Mr. Grayson. That's what he came about. Walter held her gaze for a moment that was 2 seconds longer than comfortable. Then he moved past her toward the barn, hands clasped behind his back, doing his tour of the property the way he did 3 or 4 times a year, walking the stalls, checking the equipment, reminding both of them, Clara supposed, that all of it belonged to him. She followed at a distance, watching him. Clara, he said, without turning around. I need you to understand something. This ranch runs well because we have a good arrangement. You do the work you know how to do, and I handle the business side of things. That arrangement works because we both stay in our proper places." He stopped in front of the sorrel stall. "Good horse," he said. "What are you asking for it?" 300, Clara said. Walter made a sound in the back of his throat. Not disagreement, just the sound of a man reminding himself that he is in charge of the numbers. "I'll want to be here when this Cole fellow comes to make his decision," he said. "Any sale over $100 goes through me, you know that." "Yes, sir," Clara said, and she kept her face still, and her voice flat, and her hands steady at her sides, and she watched Walter Grayson walk through the barn that her father built and felt the familiar cold fire of it. The specific kind of rage that has been carried so long, it has stopped feeling like rage and started feeling simply like weight. He left 20 minutes later without finding anything to complain about, which she knew would bother him more than if he had. Nathan came back from town that afternoon. He tied his horse at the post, looked at Clara with an expression that told her something had happened, and said, "Walk with me." They went to the north fence line, far enough from the house that a conversation stayed a conversation. "I sent the wire to Whitaker," Nathan said. "He should respond within 2 days." "Walter was here this morning," Clara said. Nathan's jaw tightened slightly. "How much does he know?" "He knows your name. He knows you were looking at horses. He wants to be present for any sale over $100. She paused. "He was reminding me of my position." "Did it work?" "It used to," Clara said. "Somewhat." Nathan looked at her. "Not anymore?" "No," Clara said simply. "Not anymore." He almost smiled. Then his expression shifted back to serious. "While I was in town, I stopped at the land office, asked to look at some public records. Nothing specific, nothing that would raise alarms, just general browsing." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara, there are 2 other properties in this county that transferred ownership in the last 10 years under circumstances that look similar to yours. A homestead that belonged to a widow named Eliza Crane, a farmstead owned by a man named George Holt, who died in 1881 with no male heirs." Clara was very still. "Both properties went to Caldwell Territories Limited," Nathan said. "Not to Walter, directly to Caldwell." "Then Walter isn't the end of it," Clara said. "Walter is the instrument," Nathan said. "Caldwell is the engine." He turned to face her fully. "Miss Bennett, if Whitaker agrees to take this case, and I believe he will, based on what I've seen in your records, this won't just be about your ranch." "It'll be about all of them," Clara said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the north pasture, bending the grass, and she felt it against her face, and thought about Eliza Crane, whoever she was, and George Holt, and how many others there might be that she didn't know about yet. "Is that?" she started, and stopped. "What?" Nathan asked. "Is that something you think I'm ready for?" she asked. It came out more raw than she intended, more honest than she usually allowed herself to be with anyone. "Because what I've been carrying for 7 years is my ranch, my father's land, that I know how to fight for. But something bigger than that." "Is more than you bargained for," Nathan said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you've been ready for a long time. I think the question is whether you're willing." Clara looked across the pasture her father had fenced with his own hands. She could feel the wood of those fence posts in her memory, the grain of them, the smell of pine sap, the particular sound they made when you drove a nail clean. She had been 5 years old the first summer she'd helped him, handing him nails from a bucket, trying not to drop them. "Tell me about Whitaker," she said. "Smart," Nathan said. "Experienced. He's won cases that other lawyers walked away from because they looked too hard or too politically complicated. He understands land law better than most judges in this territory." He paused. "He's also not easily intimidated, which matters because Caldwell will try." "What does he need from me?" "Everything you have," Nathan said. "All 14 journals. Every record you can produce that documents the discrepancy between what Walter claimed and what actually happened on this property." Any witnesses who might be willing to speak, ranch hands, buyers, anyone who dealt with this ranch and knew your father. Clara thought for a moment. Tom Ridley, she said. He worked for my father from 1870 until the year after his death. He left the county after Walter took over. He didn't like the new situation. He moved to Laramie. I've kept track of him. Would he talk? He'd talk, Clara said. He loved my father. And he knew the truth about the debt. He was there the year Walter claims my father borrowed that money. He heard every conversation between them. Nathan looked at her with that same careful attention he'd had since the first moment in the barn. That look of a man who is continuously discovering that the situation is more substantial than he initially understood. You've had a plan for a long time, he said. I've had pieces of a plan, Clara said. I was missing the part that could move. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that nobody had said to her in 7 years, and possibly longer. He said it quietly, without ceremony, the way a person states a thing they believe to be simply true. You're not missing anything, Miss Bennett. You've been the whole plan. You just needed someone to stand in the room with you. Clara looked at him. There was a part of her, the part that had been hardened down by 7 years of being called the caretaker, of being looked through in town, of watching men make decisions about her life, in rooms she wasn't invited into. That part wanted to dismiss what he'd said, wanted to call it flattery or naivety or the well-meaning condescension of someone who didn't fully understand what he was stepping into. But there was another part of her, quieter, older, the part that had kept writing in those journals every week for 7 years, because she believed, somewhere underneath all the weight of it, that the truth she was recording mattered. That part heard what Nathan Cole had said and recognized it as something different from flattery. He wasn't telling her she was impressive. He was telling her she was right. Those are two entirely different things. All right, she said. When Whitaker responds, what's the next step? Whitaker will want to meet with you directly, Nathan said. Cheyenne, most likely. Which means we need to think about how to get you there without Walter knowing why. Clara thought for a moment. I go to Laramie twice a year for supply runs. It wouldn't be unusual for me to take a longer trip. Walter doesn't track my movements closely. He's always assumed I have nowhere else to go. That's an assumption worth using, Nathan said. I'll need 2 days' notice to prepare the journals for transport, Clara said. They can't leave the property in a way that's visible. I'll need a saddlebag that doesn't look like it's carrying documents. I can arrange that. And someone needs to stay at the ranch while I'm gone. If Walter comes by and finds it empty, he'll start asking questions. Nathan nodded. Is there anyone in town you trust? Clara thought about this carefully. Trust was not a word she used carelessly. Margaret Hooper, she said finally. She runs the millinery on Benton Street. She knew my mother. She's never said a word against me, and she's said plenty against Walter Grayson in private, though she's careful about it in public. She paused. She has a nephew who's done work out here before. Good worker, honest, doesn't talk more than necessary. That could work. They stood at the fence line for a while longer without speaking, which was something Clara noticed. That silence with Nathan Cole didn't have the quality of discomfort that silence usually had with strangers. It was a working silence. The kind two people share when they're both turning the same problem over in their minds, and both know it. After a moment, Nathan said, Can I ask you something? You've been asking me things since yesterday morning, Clara said. That's fair. This one's different. He was quiet for a beat. Did you ever almost leave? In 7 years? Was there a moment when you almost packed those journals and went? Clara looked at the fence line. 1982, she said. The drought year. 3 horses died, the pasture came in bad, and Walter cut my wages in half because he said the ranch couldn't support the arrangement. She was quiet for a moment. I had a letter from a cousin in Ohio. She had a position available, running a household. Good work, steady pay, dry roof over my head. She paused. I held that letter for about a week. What made you stay? Clara turned to look at him. My father's name is on the gate, she said. Not Walter's, my father's. Walter couldn't change that without drawing attention to it, so he just, Left it. Figured it didn't matter. Figured the name on a gate doesn't mean anything when the deed says different. She looked toward the front of the property. But every morning when I rode out, and every evening when I came back, I saw Thomas Bennett on that gate. And I thought about the man who put it there, and what he would have said about me leaving. She paused. He would have understood. He wasn't the kind of man who would have blamed me. But I didn't want him to have to understand. I wanted him to be proud. Nathan was quiet for a long time. He would be, he said finally. I know, Clara said. And she said it not with emotion, but with the simple certainty of someone stating a fact they have known for a long time. The wire from Samuel Whitaker came back faster than either of them expected. 36 hours after Nathan sent his message, the reply arrived at the telegraph office in Harlan. A terse, direct, professional communication that said, in fewer words than Clara expected from a lawyer, that he had reviewed the summary Nathan provided, and that if the documentary record was as described, this was a case worth pursuing, and he would meet with the primary claimant at his Cheyenne office at her earliest convenience. Nathan brought the wire out to the ranch and set it on the table in front of Clara without a word. She read it once, quickly. Then she read it again, slowly. He used the word claimant, she said. He did. Not complainant, not petitioner, claimant. She set the wire down. That's a specific legal term. It means he thinks you have a valid claim to bring, Nathan said. Not just a grievance. Clara sat with that for a moment. There is a particular kind of feeling that comes from having a thing you have believed alone for a very long time, suddenly confirmed by someone with the authority to confirm it. It doesn't feel triumphant. It feels enormous, like the word takes up more space than the room you're in, and you're not sure yet whether you're going to be able to breathe around it. I need to write to Tom Ridley, she said. I'll wait. I need to speak to Margaret Hooper. I can ride into town tomorrow. Clara was already moving, already thinking forward, already doing what she had always done. Taking the situation in front of her and working it, piece by piece, the way her father had taught her to approach everything from a difficult foaling to a fence that didn't want to hold. But then she stopped. She turned back to the table and picked up the wire again and read it a third time. Mr. Cole, she said quietly. Ma'am. Why did you stay? He looked at her. I told you, he said. I'm the kind of man who... You told me you'd still be here in 2 weeks, she said. You didn't tell me why. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the journals on the table, all 14 of them, the whole weight of 7 years, her whole careful argument laid out in ink and paper. Then he said, because I've seen this before. Not this exactly, but the shape of it. A person who's right, who knows they're right, who's done everything a person can do to keep the truth alive and organized and ready, and they're just waiting. Waiting for someone to show up who's willing to stand beside them. He paused. I've ridden past too many of those people and kept going. I'm not doing that again. Clara looked at him for a long, quiet moment. That's a considerable thing to say, she said. It's a considerable situation, he said. Outside, one of the mares called from the south barn, a long rolling sound that carried across the yard and faded into the late afternoon. Clara folded the wire from Samuel Whitaker carefully along its original crease and set it inside the front cover of the most recent journal. I'll be ready to leave for Cheyenne by end of week, she said. I'll make the arrangements, Nathan said, and that was how it started. Not with a dramatic declaration, not with a confrontation, not with the kind of moment that announces itself as significant. Just 2 people at a table with 14 journals between them, making a plan, moving forward, the way every real thing in the world actually begins. But 3 mornings later, Clara came out of the barn just after sunrise to find a man she didn't recognize standing in her yard. Howe was young. Younger than she'd expected somehow. Mid-20s maybe. With the careful, neutral expression of a man who has been sent somewhere and told to keep his face blank about it. He was holding his horse's reins loosely, not tied to the post, which meant he wasn't planning to stay. Miss Bennett? He said. That's right, she said. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Mr. Grayson asked me to deliver this personally. Clara took the envelope without a word. The man touched his hat and led his horse back through the gate without turning around, which was exactly the kind of thing a person does when they've been told to deliver something and not get into a conversation about it. She opened the envelope standing right there in the yard. The letter was short. Walter had never been a man who wasted words on paper. It read, "Clara, I've had some conversations in town that concern me. I want to meet with you at the ranch this Friday at 10 o'clock to discuss the future of our arrangement. I expect you to be available. WG." Clara read it twice. She noted that he hadn't asked if Friday was convenient. She noted that he'd said our arrangement, which was the kind of language a man uses when he wants to remind someone of their position without saying it directly. She noted the word expect, and she noted, with a cold and precise attention, that the letter had arrived 3 days after Nathan had sent the wire to Whitaker. Walter had people in Harlan who kept their eyes open. She'd said that herself. Nathan arrived within the hour, having ridden out from town where he'd been staying at the boarding house on Marsh Street. Clara handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. His jaw did that thing it did when he was thinking hard. A slight tightening, a barely perceptible shift. "Friday is 4 days away," he said. "And we leave for Cheyenne Thursday," Clara said. Nathan looked at her. "You still want to go?" "I want to go more," Clara said. "This letter means Walter is nervous. Walter nervous means he knows someone is looking. Walter knowing someone is looking means we have less time, not more." Nathan was quiet for a moment, turning the letter over in his hands. "If we leave Thursday and Walter shows up Friday to an empty ranch, then he'll know something has changed," Clara said. "Yes, he will. But Mr. Cole, he already suspects something has changed. This letter proves it. The question is whether I want to meet with him Friday and give him the chance to manage whatever he thinks is happening, or whether I want to be sitting across from Samuel Whitaker in Cheyenne when Walter Grayson figures out that he's run out of time." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked at her not like a person assessing a situation, but like a person who is simply certain. Certain about where they're standing and who they're standing next to. "Thursday morning," he said. "Early." "Before sunrise," Clara said. Nathan nodded once. Clara folded Walter's letter carefully and set it on top of the wire from Whitaker inside the cover of the most recent journal. 2 pieces of paper. 2 different men, reaching toward the same situation from opposite directions. She looked at the 14 journals on the shelf she'd built herself against the far wall of her small room. 14 years of truth. 7 years of waiting. She thought about her father, and the name on the gate, and the way the pen felt in her hand on the first night she'd understood what she was doing. Not just keeping accounts, but keeping evidence. Building something with the only tools she had. She thought about Tom Ridley and Laramie, who had known her father and loved him and watched the whole thing happen and never stopped believing she was right. She thought about Eliza Crane and George Holt, whose names were in a land office record and whose stories she didn't know yet but understood in her bones. And then she stopped thinking about all of it, because thinking too far ahead was a way of losing your footing, and she needed her footing for what was coming. She reached for the first journal on the shelf. She had packing to do. They left before the sun came up. Clara had the journals wrapped in oilcloth and packed inside 2 saddlebags that looked, from the outside, like standard supply bags, the kind a person takes on any long ranch trip for provisions and spare equipment. She'd been careful about that. She'd thought about it for 2 days, the way she thought about everything. Methodically, accounting for what Walter might notice if someone told him she'd ridden out with bags that looked heavier than a simple supply run warranted. She left a note for Margaret Hooper's nephew, Danny, who would arrive by 7 to handle the morning feeding. The note told him exactly which horses needed what, in what order, with what quantity of feed. It told him which latch on the south barn stuck and how to work it. It told him nothing about where she was going or why, because Danny Hooper was trustworthy and honest and 17 years old, and the less he knew the better it would be for him if Walter came asking. Nathan was waiting at the north gate with both horses ready. He looked at her when she came out of the small back room for the last time that morning, carrying the 2 saddlebags, and something in his expression shifted in a way she'd started to recognize. That particular quality of attention that meant he was taking in more than the surface of what he was seeing. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said. He didn't press it. He helped her secure the bags without being asked, checked the cinch on her horse, handed her the reins. They rode out through the north gate in the dark and silence of a Wyoming dawn, with the stars still visible overhead and the grass wet under the horse's feet. And Clara did not look back at the ranch as they left. She had decided not to. Looking back was something she'd do when she had a right to, and that right wasn't here yet. They rode through the morning without much talk. Nathan set an easy pace, not hurried but steady, and Clara was grateful for that. For the understanding that this wasn't a flight, it was a strategy, and strategies don't require panic. They stopped once to water the horses at a creek crossing and eat the biscuits she'd made the night before, and Nathan drank his coffee from the canteen she'd brought and said, "Tell me about Whitaker. What do you know about him beyond what I told you?" "I looked into him," Clara said. Nathan looked at her. "When?" "The evening after you told me his name," she said. "I have a friend in Cheyenne, a woman I went to school with before she married and moved east. Her husband is a clerk at the Territorial Land Office. I wrote her a short letter the same night, asked what she knew about Whitaker." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "You wrote that letter before you knew whether I was coming back from town the next day?" "Yes," Clara said simply. He shook his head slightly. Not in criticism, she could tell. More in the manner of a man adjusting his understanding of something. "What did she say?" "He's known for being difficult," Clara said. "Not difficult to work with, difficult to move." Her husband said Walter Grayson's lawyer, Theodore Harlan, tried to have Whitaker removed from a case 3 years ago on procedural grounds. The motion was denied. Harlan tried again on different grounds 2 months later. Also denied. She looked at Nathan. "A man that Harlan has tried twice to remove is a man I'm inclined to trust." "That's sound reasoning," Nathan said. "My father taught me to evaluate a man by his enemies," Clara said. "He said you could learn more from who was against a person than from who was for them." The day wore on, and by early afternoon the outskirts of Cheyenne were visible, and by mid-afternoon they were riding down streets that were wider and louder than Harlan in every direction, with more people and more noise and more of the particular energy that a territorial capital has. The sense of things being decided, of documents being written, and power being brokered, and the whole complicated machinery of civilization grinding forward. Clara had been to Cheyenne 3 times in her life. It had never looked this specific to her before. It had never looked before like a place where something might actually happen. Samuel Whitaker's office was on a street 2 blocks off the main avenue, and it looked like what it was. The office of a man who worked hard and spent his money on books and filing cabinets rather than furniture. The front room had a desk and a clerk, a young man with ink stains on his fingers, who stood up when they came in and said that Mr. Whitaker was expecting them. Whitaker himself came out of the inner office before the clerk had finished the sentence. How was shorter than Clara expected, which she recognized immediately as an irrelevant observation but couldn't quite suppress. He was perhaps 50, with iron gray hair and the kind of face that had never been handsome and had stopped caring about that a long time ago. Angular, watchful, with eyes that went to the saddlebags in Clara's hands before they went to her face, which told her something important about how his mind worked. "Miss Bennett," he said. "I'm Samuel Whitaker. Please come in." He shook her hand first, then Nathan's. He gestured them to chairs and poured water from a pitcher on the sideboard without asking if they wanted any, which Clara appreciated. A man who offers water without asking has decided you've come far enough to be thirsty, and she respected that assumption. "Mr. Cole's wire gave me the broad outline," Whitaker said, sitting across from them. "I want to hear it from you directly, all of it. Take whatever time you need." Clara set the saddlebags on the floor beside her chair, folded her hands in her lap, and told him. She told him the same things she'd told Nathan, but differently, more precisely, more legally organized, because she'd been thinking about how to present it for 2 days, and she had her father's instinct for the shape of an argument. She told him about the debt Walter claimed. She told him about the courthouse. She told him about the 7 years. She told him about the ledgers and what they showed and what they contradicted. She told him about Tom Ridley. She told him about Caldwell Territories Limited and the other properties Nathan had found in the land records. She talked for nearly an hour. Whitaker did not interrupt her once. He took notes in a cramped, rapid hand, and occasionally he held up a finger, not to stop her, but to signal that he was writing something important and needed 3 extra seconds. And then his pen would catch up, and he'd nod, and she'd continue. When she was done, he set down his pen and looked at her. "The ledgers," he said. "You have them with you?" "Yes," Clara said. "May I?" She reached into the first saddlebag and set the journals on his desk one by one, 14 of them, and watched him open the first, and then the 6th, and then the one from 1879, the year her father died, with the careful attention of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for. After 10 minutes of that, he set it down and laced his fingers together on top of the desk. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I want to be direct with you." "Please," Clara said. "This is a strong case," he said, "not without risk. Every case involving a sitting judge and an established attorney carries political risk, and Harlan has more goodwill in this county than he deserves. But the documentary record you've produced is extraordinary. In 23 years of practice, I have not seen a private citizen maintain this quality of evidence over this length of time." He paused. "Most people who've been wronged keep their anger. You kept your records. That is the difference between a grievance and a case." Clara was very still. "However," Whitaker continued, and Clara noted the word with the particular attention she gave to any "however" that came after a "this is strong" case, "there's a piece of this that concerns me." He reached into the notes he'd made and pointed to something. "The Caldwell connection. If Thomas Caldwell is behind this, and the pattern you've described, combined with what I've seen in the land records across this territory, strongly suggests he is, then this stops being a case about your ranch and becomes something considerably larger." "Nathan told me that," Clara said. "I've had time to think about it." And, Clara said, "I've known for 7 years that the wrong done to me was part of something larger. I could feel it even when I didn't have the evidence to prove it. Other women, other families, other people who stood in a courthouse and tried to tell the truth and were told they were confused by grief or ignorance or the simple fact of being the wrong kind of person." She looked at Whitaker steadily. "If what happened to me happened to others, and if my records can help those people too, then I don't see how I could keep them only for myself." Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Nathan. "Mr. Cole," he said, "where did you find this woman?" "She found herself," Nathan said quietly. "I just showed up." Whitaker almost smiled. He turned back to Clara. "I'll take the case. I want to file a formal petition to reopen the 1879 ruling on grounds of fraudulent documentation. Simultaneously, I want to submit a separate inquiry to the Territorial Land Office regarding the Caldwell Territories acquisitions, not as part of your case directly, but as a parallel investigation that may be useful to both." He picked up his pen again. "I'll need the ledgers for at least 2 weeks to prepare. Can you leave them with me?" Clara looked at the 14 journals on his desk. 14 years of her life. 14 years of truth. The only copies of the only record that proved she was right. "Yes," she said. It was the hardest word she'd said in 7 years, and she said it without hesitation, because hesitation was something she couldn't afford. "I'll need a receipt," she said. "Obviously," Whitaker said, and was already writing it before she finished the sentence. They were back on the road to Harlan by late afternoon, riding lighter in the literal sense. The saddlebags emptied of journals, hanging slack against the horses' sides. And Clara felt the absence of that weight in a way that was both terrifying and, underneath the terror, quietly extraordinary. Like she'd been carrying something so long she'd stopped feeling it, and the moment she set it down, her whole body registered the relief at once. "You're quiet," Nathan said. "I'm thinking," Clara said. "About Whitaker?" "About Friday," she said. "Walter's letter said Friday at 10. We'll be back tomorrow night if we push the afternoon ride, which means I'll be at the ranch when he comes." Nathan looked at her. "You're going to meet with him?" "Of course I am," Clara said. If I'm not there Friday, he knows I ran. If I'm there, he thinks he still has control of the situation." She paused. "I'd like him to think that for as long as possible." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to say to him?" "I'm going to listen," Clara said. "Walter talks when he thinks he's managing someone. He says more than he means to. I've had 7 years to watch him do that." She adjusted the reins in her hands. "I want to know what he's nervous about specifically. Because whatever detail he's most careful around, that's the piece I haven't found yet." Nathan looked at her with that particular expression that she had started to think of as his understanding face. The look he got when he'd caught up to something she was already 3 steps ahead of. "You've been doing this for 7 years, he said. Not a question. "Not with a lawyer on my side," Clara said. "That part's new." They made it back to Harlan by the following evening, and Clara spent the next morning at the ranch the way she always did. Work, routine, the horses and the fences and the accounts. And she let the routine settle her the way it always had. The way work settles a person who has learned to find steadiness in use rather than in rest. Friday morning came cold and bright, with a wind off the north that had teeth in it, and Walter Grayson arrived at the ranch at 2 minutes past 10 with Theodore Harlan beside him. Clara had not expected the lawyer. She stood in the yard and watched them dismount, and she kept her face very still, and she thought, "He brought his lawyer. He brought his lawyer to a conversation he told me was about our arrangement. Which means this isn't about the arrangement at all." "Clara," Walter said. "Mr. Grayson," she said. "Mr. Harlan, I wasn't expecting 2 of you." "Theodore was in the area," Walter said, which was a lie so thin it barely warranted the breath he spent on it. Theodore Harlan's office was 15 miles from the Bennett Ranch. Nobody was in the area of the Bennett Ranch by accident. "Of course," Clara said. "Come inside." She had set 3 cups on the table that morning, which she'd thought about for a long time before she did it. 3 cups said, "I knew there would be 2 of you." 3 cups said, "Nothing about this surprises me." 3 cups said, "I am prepared." Walter noticed them. She saw him notice them. A small tightening around his eyes that passed in less than a second. She poured coffee without asking, and sat down across from them, and she folded her hands on the table the way she always did, and she waited. Walter looked around the room the way he always did, assessing, checking, and his eyes went to the shelf on the far wall where the journals usually sat, and there was nothing on that shelf now, and Clara watched him register that fact. "Where are your account books?" he said. "I reorganized my storage," Clara said. The shelf was getting cluttered. Walter looked at her. "Clara," he said, using that particular tone, the one that was almost gentle, almost paternal, the tone that meant he was about to say something she was supposed to receive without question. "I'm going to be direct with you." "I'd appreciate that," Clara said. "It's come to my attention that a man named Nathan Cole has been spending considerable time at this ranch and in this county asking questions about the property. Questions about the deed. Questions about land records." He set his hands flat on the table. "I want to know what you've told him." "He came to buy a horse," Clara said. "We talked about horses." "For 2 days?" Walter said. "He stayed at the boarding house on Marsh Street for 3 days, Clara. That's not a man who's looking at horses." "I can't account for where a stranger chooses to sleep," Clara said. Walter's jaw shifted. Harlan, beside him, had not spoken yet. He sat with his coffee cup in his hands, and his eyes moving between Clara and Walter, with the attentive patience of a man watching a game, and waiting to see when he'd be needed. "I want to know," Walter said, very quietly now, which Clara had learned long ago was more dangerous than when he was loud. "Whether you've been sharing information about this property with people who have no business knowing about it." "Mr. Grayson," Clara said, "you've told me for 7 years that this property belongs to you. If it belongs to you, then its affairs are your affairs, and I have no information to share because none of the information is mine." She held his gaze. "Which is it?" Walter stared at her. It was Harlan who spoke, setting down his coffee cup with a careful, deliberate click. "Miss Bennett," he said. His voice was smooth, professionally neutral. The voice of a man who'd spent 30 years saying difficult things without raising it. "We want to make sure you understand your situation clearly. You have a comfortable arrangement here. You have work, housing, a small wage. Mr. Grayson has been generous in allowing this arrangement to continue, but arrangements can change." "Yes," Clara said. "They can." Harlan blinked. That was not the response he'd been expecting. People who were being threatened with losing everything did not typically agree this cheerfully. "What I mean to say," Harlan continued, recalibrating, "is that if there's been any misunderstanding about the nature of this property's ownership, or if anyone has been encouraging you to question the legal record." "Mr. Harlan," Clara said, "are you asking me if I plan to pursue legal action?" A beat of silence. "I'm asking," Harlan said carefully, "whether you've been in contact with any attorneys regarding this property." Clara looked at him. 7 years. She had waited 7 years for a moment where she had enough ground under her feet to say what she was about to say, and she wanted to say it right. Not with anger. Anger was what they expected. Anger would make her look unstable and emotional and easy to dismiss. Not with triumph either, because the thing wasn't finished yet, and triumph before the finish line was something her father had always called the most expensive mistake a person could make. Just steady, just honest, just true. "Mr. Harlan," she said, "I think we both know that the document Walter used in 1879 to claim this property has some significant irregularities. I think you know that, and I think Mr. Grayson knows that. And I think the reason you're both sitting at my table on a Friday morning isn't to discuss our arrangement. It's because someone has started asking questions that neither of you has good answers to." She paused. "I've been patient for 7 years. I've been quiet. I've done the work that kept this ranch alive, and I haven't made trouble, because I understood that making trouble without the right tools was just making noise. But I want you to hear me clearly right now, both of you." She looked from Harlan to Walter and back. "I have the tools now." The room was absolutely silent. Walter Grayson's face had gone through 3 separate expressions in the last 10 seconds, and none of them were the easy confidence he'd walked in with. The first was surprise. The second was a reassessment. She could see it happening, the rapid recalculation of a man who thought he was walking into a familiar situation and has just realized the room has been rearranged. The third expression was something she'd never seen on Walter's face before in 7 years. It was fear. Not large fear. Not panic. Just the specific, cold fear of a man who has been operating under the assumption that a particular door is locked and has just heard, from the other side of it, the sound of a key. "Clara," Walter said, and now his voice had lost that particular smooth authority entirely. "You need to think carefully about what you're doing." "I've been thinking carefully about what I'm doing for 7 years, Clara said. "Whitaker," Harlan said suddenly. Clara looked at him. Something had shifted in the lawyer's face. A focused, sharp attention, like a man who has just solved a puzzle he didn't know he was working on. "You've spoken to Samuel Whitaker," Harlan said. It wasn't a question. The moment he said the name, Walter's head turned toward him with a speed that told Clara everything she needed to know about how much Harlan knew that Walter didn't. "Theodore," Walter said carefully. "What?" "Whitaker has been building a case against Caldwell Territories for 2 years, Harlan said, still looking at Clara. His voice was still smooth, but something had gone underneath it. A vibration, a tension, the sound of a man speaking calmly over the top of something that is not calm at all. "If this woman has been in contact with him, then she's not the problem anymore, is she?" Walter said, and his voice had gone completely flat. "She's the door." Clara sat very still. She had not expected them to say Whitaker's name. She had not expected Harlan to make that connection this quickly. The plan had been to let them believe she was acting alone, acting small, acting out of personal grievance, rather than as part of something larger. But Harlan was smarter than she'd accounted for, or more frightened. Those two things sometimes looked the same. "Mr. Grayson," Harlan said, turning to Walter with the focused precision of a man who has just upgraded a small problem to a large one in his mind. "We need to talk, privately." Walter stood up from the table so quickly his chair scraped back hard against the floor. He looked at Clara with an expression that was no longer managing or paternalistic, or any of the other things she'd learned to read over 7 years. It was simply furious. The kind of fury that comes from a man who has believed for a long time that he is untouchable, and has just caught a glimpse of what it might feel like to be wrong about that. "Don't do anything you can't take back," he said to her. "I could say the same to you," Clara said quietly. "But I reckon it's a bit late for both of us." They left. She sat at the table for a long time after she heard the horses leave the yard. She sat with her hands flat on the table and her coffee going cold in front of her, and the 3 cups still set out the way she'd arranged them that morning, and she breathed. Her hands were not shaking. She checked. She looked at them, both of them, flat on the table, and they were not shaking. Which surprised her, because her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in the back of her throat. But her hands were steady. She thought about that for a moment. Nathan arrived an hour later. She'd sent Danny Hooper's younger brother into town with a short note, just 2 words, "Come now." And Nathan had come. He took one look at her face when she opened the door and said, "What happened?" "They know about Whitaker," Clara said. Nathan went very still. She told him everything. Every word of the conversation, in order, with the precision she'd trained herself to maintain under pressure. Nathan listened without interrupting, the way he always did. And when she was done, he stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides, and she could see him working through it. "Harlan is the one who made the connection," Nathan said. "Yes. Which means Harlan knows more about Whitaker's investigation than Walter does," Nathan said. "Which means Harlan has a connection to Caldwell that goes deeper than just winning cases for Walter." Clara nodded slowly. "He said Whitaker has been building a case against Caldwell Territories for 2 years. Present tense. He said it like he'd been watching." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Harlan is Caldwell's man, not Walter's." The words settled. "Walter thinks he's the boss," Clara said slowly, working through it as she spoke. "He thinks this whole arrangement is his design. He borrowed money from somewhere to use Harlan to execute it, and assumed Harlan worked for him. But Caldwell was the one who needed the land," Nathan said. "He was the one who identified the properties. He needed someone local, someone who knew the county, knew the families, knew which vulnerabilities to exploit. He used Walter as the face of it, and he used Harlan as the mechanism." "And Walter doesn't know," Clara said. "Walter might suspect," Nathan said. "But suspicion and knowledge are different things, and right now Walter is scared, which means he's going to do something. The question is what?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "He's going to go to Caldwell," she said. "That's what a man does when a plan starts falling apart and he doesn't understand why. He goes to whoever he thinks is in charge." She looked at Nathan. "And when he does, Caldwell is going to realize that a woman in Harlan County has been keeping evidence for 7 years and just handed it to the best land fraud lawyer in the Wyoming Territory." Nathan looked at her steadily. "We need to warn Whitaker," he said. "I wrote him a letter this morning," Clara said, "before I sent for you. It'll go out on the afternoon post." Nathan stared at her. "You wrote him before you even told me what happened?" "I told you," Clara said simply. "I've been doing this a long time." He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in the way a person does when they keep underestimating something and they've decided to stop. "The letter tells him the situation has moved faster than we expected, and that Walter and Harlan are aware of his involvement," Clara continued. "It asks him whether the petition can be filed sooner than planned." "Can it?" "I don't know," Clara said. "I'm not a lawyer, but I know that 7 years ago, I stood in a courthouse without a plan, and a lawyer, and a 14 years of records, and I lost. And I don't plan to stand anywhere like that again." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need right now?" he said. It was such a direct question, such a simple one. And she was tired enough, and the morning had been long enough, and the weight of the last 48 hours had been sufficient enough, that she answered it honestly rather than strategically. "I need to know if Tom Ridley is still in Laramie," she said. "And I need to know if he'll come." "I'll ride to Laramie tomorrow," Nathan said. "It's a long ride," Clara said. "I've ridden longer," he said. She looked at him. There was something she'd been keeping at the back of her mind since the first morning in the barn. Something she'd been carefully not examining too directly, because direct examination of things you can't afford to count on is a way of making them fragile. But she was tired, and the morning had been what it had been, and the thing kept pressing toward the front. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Ma'am." "Nathan," she said, and using his given name for the first time felt like stepping off a curb, a small thing that changes your elevation. "Why do you keep doing this? Every day there's a new reason this could go wrong, a new thing that complicates it, a new risk that you didn't sign on for. You came here for a horse. You have stayed for—" She gestured vaguely, unable to enumerate the full scale of what she meant. Nathan looked at her with a steadiness that had no performance in it. "Because it's the right thing," he said. "And because—" He stopped, started again. "Because you are the kind of person that makes a man want to be useful in a way that actually matters. Not useful in an easy way. Useful in the way where you're scared to fail because the person you're helping is too important to fail." The words landed in the room and stayed there. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "That's a considerable thing to say," she said, which was what she'd said the first time he'd said something that moved the ground under her feet, because her vocabulary for certain kinds of honesty had gotten limited over 7 years of keeping mostly to herself. "I meant it both times I said something like that," Nathan said quietly. "I know," Clara said. She stood up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the yard and the barn and the fence line and the name on the gate, Bennett, in her father's hand, in paint that had faded and been repainted twice since his death. "My father used to say," she said, not turning around, "that the only thing worse than a fight you can't win is a fight you're capable of winning that you don't take." She paused. "I spent 7 years making sure I was capable. I think I've waited long enough." Behind her, Nathan said nothing. He didn't need to, because that, finally, was the thing that didn't need an answer. That afternoon, a letter came back from Whitaker, faster than the postal schedule should have allowed, which told her he'd had someone waiting for correspondence. It was 3 sentences. "Miss Bennett, I have received your update. The irregularities in the Grayson documentation are sufficient to request an emergency preliminary hearing. I will file Monday. Be ready." Clara read it once. She set it on the table. She went to the barn, checked each horse in turn, made sure the water was full, and the feed was measured, and everything was in its order. Then she came back inside, and sat down, and let herself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, the full weight of what was happening. All of it. The 7 years, and the courthouse, and the cold mornings, and the ledger entries, and her father's name on the gate, and Walter's face this morning, and Nathan's voice saying, "Because it's the right thing," and Samuel Whitaker in Cheyenne with 14 journals on his desk, and a filing to make on Monday. She let herself feel all of it for 60 seconds. Then she stood up, picked up her pen, and started making a list of everything that needed to be done before Monday. Because Clara Bennett had not survived 7 years by waiting to feel ready. She had survived by working. And the work, finally, was almost done. Nathan rode to Laramie and came back in 2 days. Clara knew the moment she saw him come through the gate that Tom Ridley had said yes. There was something in the way. Nathan sat his horse when he had good news. Not triumphant, not loose, but a kind of contained forward energy, like a man who is carrying something important and is being careful with it. He dismounted and said without preamble, "He's coming Thursday." Clara set down the bucket she was holding. "He didn't hesitate," Nathan continued. "I told him what was happening, the broad strokes, not everything, and he didn't let me finish before he said yes. He said, and I want to quote this exactly because I think you should hear it. He said, 'I've been waiting 7 years for someone to come ask me that question.'" Clara pressed her lips together for a moment. "How is he?" she asked. "Old," Nathan said. "Strong. Angry in that quiet way men get when they've been carrying a righteous anger for a very long time and haven't had anywhere to put it." He looked at her. "He said to tell you your father would be proud." He started to say something else and stopped, so I didn't push. "He never could finish that sentence without his voice going," Clara said quietly. "Even when my father was alive." She picked up the bucket again and went back to work, because that was how she handled the things that moved her most. She kept her hands busy and let the feeling settle on its own terms without making a production of it. By Wednesday morning, there were 4 things happening at once, which was approximately 4 more things than Clara had successfully managed simultaneously in the previous 7 years, and she handled it with the methodical calm of someone who has decided that chaos is simply a planning problem. Whitaker had sent a second letter. The preliminary hearing had been granted for the following Tuesday in Cheyenne before a territorial judge named Hargrove. Not a county judge, not someone embedded in the local network of favors and fishing trips that had sustained Theodore Harlan's career for 30 years. A territorial judge was appointed from outside, which meant the particular web that Walter and Harlan had maintained in Harlan County had significantly less reach than it was accustomed to. The letter also said something else. Whitaker had requested, as part of the preliminary hearing, the original deed document that Walter had used in 1879, the document that had been filed in the county courthouse and had remained in the public record ever since. Standard procedure. Public record was public record. What was not standard was what Whitaker had found when he requested it. The document was missing, not misfiled, not checked out to another party. Gone, in the particular way that things go missing when someone with access to the filing room has decided they need to go missing, which is completely and with no record of removal. Clara read that part of the letter 3 times. Nathan read it once and said very quietly, "They know." "They know," Clara agreed. "Harlan has someone in the courthouse. Harlan has someone everywhere," Clara said. "He's been practicing in this county for 30 years, she set the letter down. "But here's what they don't know. They took the original document because they think that's the evidence. They think if the original is gone, the claim falls apart." She looked at Nathan. "They don't know about the copy." Nathan looked at her. "What copy?" Clara went to the back room and came back with a slim folder she'd kept separate from the main journals, not in the oilcloth wrapping, not in the box that had gone to Whitaker, but in the lining of her good winter coat, stitched there by her own hand 6 years ago. She laid it on the table. Inside was a handwritten transcript of the original deed document, copied word for word in Clara's precise handwriting on the day before the courthouse ruling in 1879, the day she'd been allowed, briefly, to examine the document as part of the legal proceedings, while her useless court-appointed advocate had argued a procedural point with Harlan in the hallway. Clara had sat in that room for 11 minutes with the document and a pencil stub she'd brought in her dress pocket, and she had copied every word. She had been 20 years old. Nathan looked at the transcript. He looked at her. "You copied it," he said. "At the courthouse, before the ruling." "My father taught me that truth deserved a paper trail," Clara said. "I started early." Nathan sat back in his chair with an expression she'd never seen on him before. It was somewhere between shattered and awed, the look of a man encountering something that is larger than he has the immediate vocabulary to address. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Clara," she said, because they were past that now. "Clara," he said. "Do you understand what this means? It means that removing the original from the courthouse didn't accomplish what they hoped," she said. "It means that Whitaker can present a verified transcript and argue that the removal itself constitutes evidence of intent to obstruct." She paused. "And it means that whoever removed that document just handed us a separate count of tampering with court records." Nathan stared at her. "You knew," he said. "You knew they might try to remove the document." "I didn't know," Clara said carefully. "I suspected. When Harlan made that connection at the table last Friday, when I saw how quickly he moved, I thought about what I would do if I were him, if I were trying to protect a case that was about to collapse." She folded her hands. "A man like Harlan doesn't fight with arguments when he can fight with absences." "So you sent the copy to Whitaker?" "I sent it the same afternoon I wrote the letter about the preliminary hearing," Clara said, "before we even knew the original was missing." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I came here to buy a horse." "I know," Clara said. "I need you to understand," he said slowly, "that I have met a significant number of people in my life, and I have never, not once, met anyone like you." Clara looked at him for a moment. "That's very kind," she said. "Now help me figure out what Harlan does next." What Harlan did next arrived Thursday morning in the form of Tom Ridley and a complication. Tom Ridley was 61 years old and built like someone had stacked decades of ranch work on top of a young man's frame. Broad through the shoulders, slow in the joints, with a face that had been weathered down to its essential structure and hands that had never quite uncalloused in 40 years. He dismounted in the yard and looked at Clara for a long moment without speaking, and she looked at him, and then he said, "Lord, girl, you look just like him." "I know," Clara said. "Come inside." They sat at the table and Tom Ridley talked for 2 hours, and every word he said was ammunition. He'd been there in 1876 when the cattle prices dropped and Thomas Bennett had struggled. He confirmed that Walter Grayson had offered a loan, and that Thomas had declined it. Not because he didn't need help, but because Thomas Bennett had said, in Tom Ridley's direct hearing, that he didn't trust a man who offered money without specifying his terms. He'd said he'd rather sell 3 horses and eat lean through winter than owe Walter Grayson a single dollar of unspecified debt. Tom Ridley had been standing 6 feet away when Thomas said it. "You'll testify to that," Clara said. "Under oath, in front of God and whoever else is in the room," Tom said. "I should have testified 7 years ago. I should have stood up in that courthouse and said what I'm telling you now. I didn't because—" He stopped, set his jaw, started again. "Because I was afraid. Walter had friends and I was a ranch hand, and I didn't think my word would hold against his paper." He looked at Clara. "I've regretted that every day since. You were 20 years old, and you were standing in that courthouse alone, and I knew the truth and I kept it to myself." His voice had gone rough. "That's something I owe you, Clara. I owe you that debt." "You're paying it now," Clara said. "Better late than a coward forever," Tom said. The complication arrived an hour after Tom did. It arrived in the form of a man Clara recognized. Bill Stokes, who worked odd jobs in town and did occasional labor for Walter Grayson when Walter needed something done that he didn't want to put his own name to. Stokes rode up to the gate and tied his horse and came to the door and knocked. And when Clara opened it, he had the look of a man who has been sent to deliver an unpleasant message and is regretting the job. "Miss Bennett," he said, "Mr. Grayson asked me to inform you that he's filing a formal complaint with the county sheriff regarding unauthorized use of ranch property. He's claiming that you've been conducting business transactions and sharing proprietary financial information without his authorization." Stokes paused. "He said to tell you that if you proceed with whatever it is you're proceeding with, he'll have the sheriff remove you from the property by end of week." Clara looked at him steadily. "Mr. Stokes," she said, "did Walter write that down?" Stokes blinked. "Ma'am? Did he give you a written statement? A formal notice? Something with his signature on it?" Stokes shifted his weight. "He told me to tell you." "Then thank you for delivering the message," Clara said pleasantly. "You can tell Mr. Grayson that I received it." She closed the door. Nathan had heard everything from the table. He looked at her. "He's trying to preempt the hearing," he said. "He's panicking," Clara said. "Walter panics by adding more weight. He thinks if he piles enough pressure on fast enough, I'll break before Tuesday." She sat back down across from Tom Ridley. "He doesn't know what day it is." Tom Ridley looked between them with the measured attention of an old ranch hand watching 2 people work, assessing the quality of the partnership, the way you assess the way 2 horses move together before you decide to put them in a traces pair. "This cowboy of yours," Tom said to Clara, in the blunt, unceremonious way of a man who's earned the right to say what he sees. "He good?" "He's the reason I'm not still waiting," Clara said. Tom looked at Nathan. "You know what you're stepping into, son?" he said. "Getting clearer on it every day," Nathan said. Tom nodded once, slowly, the way old men nod when they've decided a younger man has passed a test. "Good. Because Walter Grayson has been a bully his whole life, and the thing about bullies is, they only ever had one move. They just kept using it because nobody ever took it away from them." He looked at Clara. "You're about to take it away." "That's the plan," Clara said. On Sunday, Harlan made his next move, and it was smarter than the Stokes visit. A formal letter arrived from Harlan's office, addressed to Samuel Whitaker in Cheyenne. with a copy sent to the territorial court, claiming that the pending preliminary hearing was based on fraudulent evidence. Specifically, that the documents Clara had provided were fabricated, that the journals were not contemporaneous records, but had been created recently to support a false claim, and that a handwriting expert retained by the Grayson estate was prepared to testify to this at the hearing. Clara read the letter when Whitaker wired her a summary of its contents. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she said to Nathan, who was watching her face carefully, "He's claiming the journals are forgeries." Nathan said nothing. 14 years of records, Clara said. 14 journals. He's claiming I fabricated them. Her voice was entirely level. He's going to put an expert on the stand who will say I wrote them recently. "Can they do that?" Tom Ridley asked from across the room. "They can claim it," Nathan said. "Whether they can prove it is a different matter. Paper ages, ink ages. A real expert can date documents within a reasonable range." "Whitaker will know that," Clara said. "Whitaker already knows that," Nathan said. "That's why Harlan filed the claim before the hearing instead of during it. He wants to create doubt before the judge has seen the evidence. He wants the judge walking into that courtroom already suspicious." Clara was quiet. She was thinking about something. She could feel it working in the back of her mind. The particular sensation of a thought that isn't fully formed yet, but is close. The way you can hear a horse coming before you can see it. "The ink," she said slowly. Nathan looked at her. "Whitaker has the journals," she said. "If Harlan claims they're forged, Whitaker will have them examined. A document examiner will look at the ink, the paper, the writing characteristics." She paused. "But there's something else. Something Harlan doesn't know about." "What?" Nathan said. Clara stood up and went to the shelf near the window. Not the shelf where the journals had been, but a smaller shelf beside it, where she kept a collection of items that anyone looking at would categorize as miscellaneous personal objects. A small wooden box, a folded piece of ribbon, a tin that had once held peppermints and now held buttons, and a letter. She brought the letter to the table. It was old. The paper had the particular weight and faint yellow of something that had been kept carefully in a dry place for many years. The writing on it was her father's. She would know it anywhere, in any light, in any condition, because a person's father's handwriting is a specific thing that lives in the body as much as the mind. "My father wrote this to me," she said. "In 1875. It's about the ranch accounts. He was in Laramie for 2 weeks buying livestock, and he wrote to me about the ledger. Specifically, he references the account book I was keeping, calls it by the name I'd given it, mentions entries I'd made the week before." She looked at Nathan. "This letter proves the journal existed in 1875, in my father's hand, with the account book referenced by name." The room was very quiet. Tom Ridley let out a long, slow breath. "Lord Almighty," he said softly. Nathan looked at the letter, then at Clara, then back at the letter. "You've had this the whole time," he said. "It was personal," Clara said simply. "It was a letter from my father. It wasn't something I thought about as evidence. It was something I thought about as mine." She paused. "But if Harlan wants to tell a judge that I fabricated 14 years of records, then I think it's time my father weighs in on the question." She sent the letter to Whitaker on the first post Monday morning. The night before the hearing, Clara did not sleep. She lay in the small back room that had been her home for 7 years and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling in the dark. The horses shifting in the barn, the wind along the roofline, the particular deep quiet of Wyoming night that is not actually quiet at all if you've learned to listen to it. And she thought about her father. She thought about him the way she usually thought about him when things were very large, not as a memory of a specific moment, but as a presence. The sense of him. The particular quality of what it had been like to be near a man who was fundamentally unafraid of difficulty. Not because he was reckless or because he didn't understand risk, but because he had decided very early that the work in front of him was worth whatever the work cost. And that decision had settled something in him that never quite unsettled again. She had spent 7 years trying to be worthy of that. She thought she might be now. Nathan knocked on her door at 5 in the morning, which was when they'd agreed to leave. "Ready?" he said when she opened it. Before you knocked, she said. He looked at her, at the way she was standing, at her face, at whatever he was always reading when he looked at her, that seemed to give him accurate information. And something in his expression settled. Clara, he said. I know, she said. I was going to say, I know, she said again. Let's go. They rode to Cheyenne in the dark, with Tom Ridley following on his own horse, and they arrived at Whitaker's office before 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in October, with the wind coming cold off the ranges and the territorial courthouse 3 blocks away and 7 years of waiting 1 day from its end. Whitaker met them at the door. He looked at Clara with the particular expression of a man who has been up most of the night working and has found something worth the lost sleep. Come in, he said. There are developments. The first development was that the document examiner Whitaker had engaged, a woman named Dr. Eliza Marsh, who had been doing forensic document examination for the federal courts for 12 years, had completed her preliminary analysis of the journals. Her finding was that the ink composition, paper degradation, and writing characteristics were consistent with documents produced over a period of no less than 10 years. She had found evidence of at least 4 different NIB types across the journals, consistent with natural replacement of writing instruments over time, and she had identified a progressive change in Clara's handwriting that was consistent with natural maturation. The handwriting of a 15-year-old is measurably different from the handwriting of a 22-year-old, and both were present in the records. In her professional opinion, the journals were genuine contemporaneous documents. The second development was larger. Whitaker sat them down and leaned forward across his desk. The letter from your father, he said to Clara. The one referencing the account book. Yes. I showed it to Dr. Marsh this morning, Whitaker said. She compared the handwriting to the signature on the 1879 deed, the signature Walter Grayson claimed was your father's. Clara felt something change in the room, a quality of air, the way a room feels before something happens in it. And, Nathan said. Whitaker looked at Clara. The signature on the 1879 deed, he said carefully, does not match your father's handwriting, not in the way that handwriting naturally varies from document to document. It matches in the broad strokes, the general shape of the letters, but the pressure pattern is wrong, the letter connections are wrong, and 3 specific letter formations that appear consistently in your father's genuine writing are absent from the signature on the deed. The room was absolutely still. She'll testify to this? Clara said. Under oath, Whitaker said. And she is, to put it plainly, unimpeachable. Harlan's expert is a man named Prescott, who has testified in 4 cases in this territory, 3 of which were for clients connected to Caldwell's business interests. Judge Hargrove will know that. Tom Ridley, who had been sitting quietly against the wall since they came in, said in a low voice, The signature was forged. The signature was forged, Whitaker confirmed. It was forged the whole time, Tom said. He wasn't talking to anyone in the room. He was talking to some version of the past that he'd been living adjacent to for 7 years without knowing. Thomas never signed that paper. He never owed Walter a cent. It was a lie from the first word. Yes, Clara said quietly. Tom put his hands over his face. The courtroom that Tuesday was not the kind of dramatic spectacle that the word courtroom sometimes conjures. It was a working room in a territorial courthouse, functional, worn, with the smell of old wood and lamp oil and the particular institutional gravity of a place where difficult things are decided. Judge Hargrove was a compact, spare man of perhaps 60, with the face of someone who has heard a very great many arguments and is not easily impressed by volume or rhetoric, and reserves his attention for the things that are actually true. Walter Grayson was there with Theodore Harlan. Clara had known they would be. She had thought about how it would feel to see Walter across a formal room, and she'd found, when she actually looked at him, that it felt surprisingly simple. He looked like what he was, a man who had committed a wrong and spent 7 years avoiding its consequences, and was now sitting in a room where the consequences had finally arrived. He looked smaller than he did on the ranch. They all look smaller, she thought, when the room is level. Whitaker was methodical, precise, and relentless. He presented the case in the order he'd described to Clara. The ledgers, the transcript of the original deed, the forensic analysis, Tom Ridley's testimony, the letter from Thomas Bennett, the expert comparison of handwriting. Tom Ridley took the witness stand and said, in a voice that was rough but steady, exactly what he'd told Clara 3 days before. He had been present in 1876. Thomas Bennett had declined Walter Grayson's offer of a loan. He had heard the words. He remembered them specifically because of the way Thomas had said them, with the particular quiet firmness of a man who has made up his mind and doesn't need to raise his voice about it. Harlan cross-examined him with the professional sharpness of a man whose career was on the line, and Tom Ridley sat through it the way old ranch hands sit through difficult weather. Patient, immovable, answering each question in the same direct manner without ornamentation or embellishment. Harlan's expert testified that in his opinion, the journals showed signs of recent fabrication. Dr. Marsh then took the stand and explained, in technical detail, that was nonetheless completely comprehensible, exactly why that opinion was incorrect. She addressed each of his specific claims with counter-evidence. She described the progressive handwriting development. She described the NIB type analysis. She described the paper degradation patterns. She described the ink composition findings. And then she explained, calmly, and with the authority of 12 years of federal court work, what the comparison between Thomas Bennett's genuine handwriting and the signature on the 1879 deed had revealed. Harlan objected 4 times during her testimony. Judge Hargrove sustained none of them. When Dr. Marsh stepped down, there was a quality in the room that Clara recognized from the very few moments in her life when a large thing had irrevocably moved. The particular silence of a situation that has tipped past its balance point and is no longer capable of going back. Walter Grayson was staring at the table in front of him. Harlan was writing something on a piece of paper, quickly, with the focused desperation of a man trying to find a way out of a room whose doors have all just locked. Judge Hargrove looked at the documents on his desk for a long time. Then he said, "Mr. Whitaker, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer." "Of course, Your Honor." "In your professional opinion, is the signature on this deed document authentic?" Whitaker said, "No, Your Honor, it is not." "And the debt claimed in the deed, the supposed $3,000 loan from Mr. Grayson to the late Thomas Bennett?" "The documentary evidence and witness testimony both contradict the existence of that debt," Whitaker said. "There is no record of any such transaction in the ranch accounts, no record in any bank, and a direct eyewitness who was present during the period in question who will testify it never occurred." Judge Hargrove looked at Walter Grayson. Walter looked back at him. Something happened in Walter's face in that moment. A collapse of something that had been held in place for a very long time by the particular confidence of a man who has never been caught. It didn't come apart dramatically. It came apart the way things come apart when they've been under sustained pressure for a sustained period, quietly, in stages, each piece going separately. "Mr. Grayson," Judge Hargrove said, "do you have anything to add?" Walter opened his mouth, and then Theodore Harlan put his hand on Walter's arm and leaned in and said something very quietly, and Walter closed his mouth. Harlan stood. "Your Honor," Harlan said, and even his voice, that smooth professional instrument, had something underneath it now, a slight roughness, a barely audible unsteadiness, the sound of a man speaking carefully around the edge of something enormous. "My client would like to request a brief recess to consider his position." Judge Hargrove looked at Harlan for a long, quiet moment. "Your client," Judge Hargrove said, "has had 7 years to consider his position." He straightened the papers on his desk. "We'll continue." Clara was sitting very still at the plaintiff's table beside Whitaker, and she kept her hands flat on the wood in front of her, and she kept her face composed, and she kept her eyes on the judge, and underneath all of that, underneath the composure and the strategy and the years of careful preparation, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. She felt certain, not hopeful, not cautiously optimistic. Certain, the way you feel when a truth that has been yours your whole life is finally being acknowledged in a room large enough to matter. Judge Hargrove spoke for 12 minutes. He spoke about the documentary record and the forensic analysis and the witness testimony. He spoke about the standards of evidence required to set aside a prior ruling. He spoke about the principle that the court's purpose was the administration of justice, not the protection of decisions that had been made on fraudulent grounds. And then he said the words, "Not all at once." Not in a single dramatic sentence. In the methodical, formal language of a territorial court, piece by piece, the ruling took shape. The 1879 deed transfer was set aside on grounds of fraudulent documentation. The property known as the Bennett Ranch in Harlan County was to be restored to the estate of Thomas Bennett, with Clara Bennett as sole surviving heir and rightful owner. He ordered an immediate investigation into the circumstances of the missing original deed document. He referred the matter of Thomas Caldwell and Caldwell Territories, limited to the Territorial Attorney General's office, for separate investigation. He looked at Theodore Harlan and said, very quietly, that the conduct of legal counsel in this matter would be the subject of a formal review by the Territorial Bar. Clara sat at the table and heard all of it. She heard every word, and she did not cry, because she had decided a long time ago that the day she won this, she would not spend it crying. She had cried enough in private over 7 years to last her the rest of her life, and she intended to spend this moment in the same way she had spent the last 7 years. Clear-eyed, fully present, not missing a single thing. She heard it all. When it was over and the room was beginning to move again, Whitaker gathering papers, Harlan sitting motionless, Walter already on his feet and heading for the door with the mechanical urgency of a man whose body has decided to leave before his mind has caught up. Nathan Cole, who had been sitting in the gallery behind the plaintiff's table, leaned forward and put his hand briefly on Clara's shoulder. Just that. Just a hand on her shoulder, for one moment. She reached up and put her hand over his. Just for a moment. Then she straightened, squared her shoulders, and stood up to face what came next. Because Clara Bennett had never been a woman who sat still when there was work to do. And the work, the real work, the work of living in a life that was actually hers, was only just beginning. Tom Ridley was waiting for her in the corridor outside the courtroom. He looked at her when she came through the door, and she looked at him, and he said, "Thomas would have been in there turning cartwheels." "He would have embarrassed himself completely," Clara agreed. Tom laughed. A real laugh, short and rough, the laugh of a man releasing something that has been compressed for a very long time. Then he put his arms around her, briefly and firmly, in the way of a man who knew her father and has discharged a debt he thought he might carry to his grave. Clara let him. Outside the courthouse, the wind was still coming cold off the ranges, and the territorial capital moved around them with the ordinary momentum of a place that doesn't know what has just happened inside one of its buildings, and Clara stood on the steps and breathed. Just breathed. Nathan came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. They stood there in the October wind, both of them looking out at a street full of people going about their Tuesday morning. And Clara felt the specific gravity of a life that had just changed its direction after 7 years of pointing the same difficult way. She thought about going home. Not to the small back room. Not to the hired hand's quarters with the loose floorboard and the box underneath it. Home. To the house her father built. To the room she'd slept in as a girl before the world rearranged itself. To the place where the name on the gate was not a reminder of what had been lost, but the simple, accurate description of who owned the land behind it. She was going home. "Clara," Nathan said. "Yes," she said. "What do you need to do first?" She thought about it for exactly 1 moment. "I need to write a letter," she said. "To Eliza Crane, and George Holt's family, and whoever else Whitaker finds when he starts pulling on the Caldwell thread." She paused. "They need to know that someone found a way through." Nathan nodded. "After that?" he said. Clara almost smiled. "After that," she said, "I'm going to go home and sleep in my own bedroom for the first time in 7 years." The ride back to Harlan took the better part of 2 days, and Clara spent most of it quiet. Not the tense, watchful quiet of the last several weeks. The quiet of a person monitoring every variable, tracking every threat, calculating every move. This was different. This was the quiet of a person who has been running hard for a very long time and has finally, in the middle of the journey home, been given permission to breathe. Nathan rode beside her and didn't push conversation. Tom Ridley rode slightly behind, which Clara suspected was his way of giving them space, and which she appreciated without saying so. On the second afternoon, about an hour out from Harlan, Nathan said, "What are you thinking about?" "The letter," Clara said. She had been composing it in her head since they left Cheyenne. The letter to Eliza Crane, wherever she was now. The letter to the Holt family. "I want to get the words right. I don't want to give them false hope. Whitaker says the Caldwell investigation could take months, years possibly." "But it started," Nathan said. "It started," Clara agreed. "That's what I want them to know. That someone found the door." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "You know, most people, after what you've just been through, would spend at least a few days thinking about themselves." Clara glanced at him. "I am thinking about myself. That's who I was 2 years ago, sitting somewhere not knowing whether anyone was ever going to find the door." She looked back at the road ahead. "I know exactly what Eliza Crane is feeling right now, or what she felt when she lost everything. I'd like her to feel something different." Nathan said nothing, but she felt him looking at her with that particular quality of attention that she had stopped trying to categorize, because every time she thought she understood what it meant, he added something to it that made the category too small. They came through the gate of the Bennett Ranch in the late afternoon of the second day. Clara stopped her horse just inside the gate and looked at it. The name on the gatewood, Bennett, in her father's paint, faded and repainted and faded again. She had seen it every day for 7 years. She had ridden through it thousands of times. But she had not ridden through it as the owner since she was 20 years old. She sat there for a long moment. Tom Ridley pulled up beside her and looked at the gate and then at her face and didn't say a word, which was the right thing. Nathan stopped on her other side. Clara straightened in the saddle, squared her shoulders, and rode through. The first thing she did was walk every inch of the property. Not because she didn't know it. She knew it better than she knew her own hands. But because knowing it as the woman who kept it running and knowing it as the woman who owned it were two different things, and she wanted to feel the difference. She wanted to walk the fence lines and the barn and the pastures and the horse paddocks and feel the land under her feet, the way her father had described feeling it. Not as a responsibility assigned to you, but as a thing that is yours, genuinely and legally, and completely yours, in a way that no document can take back, because the document now says the right name. She walked for an hour. Nathan stayed at the barn with the horses, giving her the space to do it alone. She noticed that, and filed it away in the place where she kept the evidence of who he was, the accumulating record of a man who understood, without being told, what she needed. When she came back to the house, she went inside for the first time since she'd been moved to the back room 7 years ago. Walter had changed very little. She'd expected that, actually. Walter wasn't a man who improved things. He was a man who used them. The furniture was older. Some things were moved. The kitchen had been rearranged in a way that suggested someone who didn't understand how the kitchen was meant to work had made decisions about it. But her father's desk was still in the corner room. Still in the same position. Still facing the window the way he'd always placed it, because he'd said he liked to look at what he was working for while he worked. Clara stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment. She went to the desk and sat down in the chair, and she put her hands flat on the surface of it. The worn oak, the grain of it, the specific texture of a surface her father had sat at for 20 years. And she stayed there without moving until the feeling in her chest settled from enormous to simply large. Then she got up and started the work of taking her house back. It took 3 days to make the house right again. Danny Hooper helped, and Margaret Hooper came out on the second day with 2 other women from town who had known Thomas Bennett and had views about how the kitchen should be arranged. And the result was a great deal of productive activity and some emphatic opinions about curtains. Clara let it happen around her, participating where she was useful and stepping back when the situation didn't need her, which was its own kind of luxury. The luxury of being in a place where you could choose your level of involvement, rather than carrying every task by necessity. Nathan helped with the practical work. Moving furniture, repairing a section of porch railing that had been neglected, fixing the stuck latch on the south barn door that Clara had worked around for 2 years, rather than asking Walter to have it repaired. On the second evening, Nathan fixed the latch in approximately 20 minutes and came into the kitchen afterward with the expression of a man who has accomplished something small and found it satisfying. "That latch," Clara said. "Done," Nathan said. "I worked around that latch for 2 years," Clara said. "I noticed." "It's a small thing," Clara said. "Small things matter," Nathan said simply, and accepted the cup of coffee she held out and sat down at the kitchen table, and Clara sat across from him, and the kitchen was warm, and the latch was fixed, and the house was hers. And she thought that there were moments in a life that don't announce themselves as significant, but that you know, while they're happening, that you will remember them. This was one. On the fourth morning, a letter arrived. It was from Whitaker. He had moved quickly. She'd known he would, because Whitaker was a man who understood that momentum was its own kind of evidence. The letter outlined the formal next steps in the Caldwell investigation. 3 additional families had already been identified as potential victims of the same land acquisition scheme. Whitaker was coordinating with the Territorial Attorney General's office, and there was, and here Clara read the sentence 3 times, a federal land commissioner who had been alerted to the pattern and was considering opening an inquiry at the federal level. Federal. That word landed with a weight that was different from all the others. Walter Grayson had provided a statement to the territorial authorities. He was, Whitaker noted with a brief and professional restraint, being cooperative, which Clara understood to mean that Walter had discovered the full extent of his own position in the scheme, and was now prioritizing his own survival over his loyalty to Thomas Caldwell. Theodore Harlan had retained separate counsel. Thomas Caldwell had not yet been formally charged, but Whitaker expected that to change within the month. Clara folded the letter and set it on her father's desk. She thought about Walter sitting somewhere giving a statement, methodically dismantling the structure that had taken her family's land, doing it not out of conscience, but out of the particular calculus of a man who has concluded that loyalty is a luxury for people who aren't facing a federal inquiry. She thought about whether she felt satisfaction about that. She felt something cleaner than satisfaction. She felt the specific, calm certainty of a person watching justice work at its own pace, in its own way, doing the thing it was designed to do. She picked up her pen and started writing the letter to Eliza Crane. She wrote it twice. The first version was too careful, too measured, too much the voice of a woman who has learned to present herself strategically rather than simply. She read it back and thought, "This is not the letter I needed someone to write to me. This is the letter I would have written in the courthouse, before I understood what it felt like to be believed." She started again. The second version was shorter and more direct. It said, "I know what happened to you, because something similar happened to me. I know the feeling of standing in a room and telling the truth and being told you're wrong. I know the particular loneliness of keeping the evidence when nobody is asking for it yet. There is a lawyer named Samuel Whitaker in Cheyenne. He is the kind of man who asks for the evidence. I think you should write to him." She signed it with her full name, Clara Bennett, Bennett Ranch, Harlan County, Wyoming Territory. She sealed it and addressed it and set it with the letter to the Holt family, which she wrote immediately after, in the same voice, direct, honest, one person telling another person the way through a door. She felt, sending those letters, more herself than she had felt in 7 years. Nathan found her on the porch that evening. He sat down beside her without asking, which was something she'd noticed he always did. He didn't ask permission for the things that were reasonable. He just did them, quietly, and she appreciated the economy of it. They sat for a while without talking, the way they'd developed a habit of doing, comfortable enough in the same space that silence was simply part of the conversation rather than an absence of it. "Whitaker's letter came," she said. "I know. You've had your thinking face on all day." Clara looked at him. "I have a thinking face?" "You have 17 faces," Nathan said. "I've been cataloging them. The thinking face is the one where your eyes go very still and your hands stop moving." "That sounds like my resting face," Clara said. "No. Your resting face is when your hands are in motion and your eyes are moving. The thinking face is when everything stops." She considered this. "You've been paying considerable attention." "Yes," he said, without any particular performance of it. Just the simple fact. Clara was quiet for a moment. The sun was going down over the Bennett Ranch in the particular slow way of Wyoming autumn evenings. Not dramatic, just steady, the light changing gradually from gold to amber to a deep rose at the edge of the sky. The horses were settled in the barn. The south barn latch worked. Her name was on the deed. "Nathan," she said. "Ma'am." "Clara," she corrected, and he almost smiled. "Clara," he said. She turned to look at him directly, which was something she had learned to do in the last several weeks. To look at this person straight on, rather than at an angle, which was how she'd learned to look at most people as a form of self-protection. Looking at people directly meant they could see what looking at them did to your face, and for a long time, she hadn't been able to afford that. "What happens now?" she said. "For you. Not for the case or the investigation or any of the rest of it. For you." Nathan looked at her steadily. "I came here for a horse," he said. "You keep saying that." "It keeps being relevant," he said. "I came here for a horse and I found—" He paused. "I found that I didn't particularly want to leave." "You've been here nearly a month," Clara said. "I have." "Is there somewhere else you should be?" "There was," he said. "I had work lined up in Colorado. A land survey job, should have started 3 weeks ago. I sent word that I was delayed." Clara absorbed this. "You delayed your work for this." "I delayed my work for you," Nathan said. Quietly, clearly, looking at her the whole time he said it. There's a difference. The space between them had the particular quality of a moment that is waiting to go one direction or another, and Clara felt it. The same instinct that told her when a horse was about to make a decision, when the weight was shifting, when something was about to move. She had not let herself want things in a very long time. Wanting things required believing they were possible. And for 7 years, she had kept her wanting very narrowly focused. The ranch, the truth, the right name on the deed. Those she had allowed herself to want because they were the things she was fighting for. Everything else she had kept at a careful distance, because wanting what you cannot have while you are fighting for what you must have is a way of losing your footing. But the ranch was hers now. The truth had been told. The deed said the right name. She didn't need to keep her footing for the same reason anymore. "I have a horse to sell you," she said. Nathan looked at her. "The sorrel," she said. "You never finished deciding." "No," he said. "I didn't." "He's a good horse," Clara said. "Strong, steady, not prone to spooking. Everything I told you the first morning." She held Nathan's gaze. "But I think, if you're going to be spending time in this county, you might want to consider whether you need to board him somewhere or whether there's a more permanent arrangement available." Nathan was very still. "A more permanent arrangement," he repeated. "The Bennett Ranch has always had a position for a good foreman," Clara said. "Someone who knows land and accounts and isn't intimidated by the work." She paused. "And who is still here 2 weeks later when things get complicated." "I've been here a month," Nathan said. "Then you're overqualified," Clara said. He almost smiled. And then the almost became something fuller, and it changed his whole face. Not dramatically, but genuinely. The smile of a man who has spent a significant amount of time being serious and has found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he has arrived somewhere that makes it unnecessary. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Clara," she said. "Clara," he said. "Are you offering me a job or something else?" She looked at him. "I'm offering you both," she said. "In whatever order you prefer." The autumn settled over the Bennett Ranch in the weeks that followed with the particular richness of a season that knows it's been earned. Clara hired 2 permanent hands. Men she'd known by reputation for years. Men that other ranchers in the county trusted. Men who shook her hand when they were hired and said yes ma'am to her as the natural form of address rather than as a compensatory addition. She reorganized the breeding program with the full authority of someone who no longer had to route her decisions through a man who didn't understand them. She met with Whitaker twice more before the end of the year. The Caldwell investigation had opened formally by November, with federal involvement that was broader than even Whitaker had initially anticipated. There were properties across 3 territories that fell within the pattern, and the Attorney General's office was building a case that was significantly larger than any of them. Thomas Caldwell was indicted in December. Clara heard the news on a Tuesday and sat with it for a long time before she let herself feel anything about it. When she did let herself feel it, what she found was not triumph. Not anger finally released. Something more complicated and more complete than either of those things. The feeling of a person who has seen something wrong in the world and spent years working to make it right, and has watched the right finally, slowly, expensively happen. She wrote to Whitaker and asked him to keep her informed on the other families. She wrote to Eliza Crane again, because Eliza had written back. A short letter, uncertain in its phrasing. The letter of a woman who had spent so long not being believed that she was not yet sure how to write to someone who believed her. Clara wrote back with the same directness she'd used in the first letter, and then she wrote back again when Eliza responded. And by December, they were corresponding regularly, and Clara had passed Whitaker's name along twice more to people Eliza knew who had found themselves in similar circumstances. The thread, once pulled, kept coming. Tom Ridley came to stay through the winter, which had not been the plan, but became the plan naturally, the way things do when they fit. He managed the winter cattle work with the ease of a man returning to a language he'd always spoken, and he and Nathan developed the particular efficient shorthand of 2 people who respect each other's competence and don't waste words on what doesn't need saying. Clara watched them work together from the porch one morning in November and felt something that took her a moment to identify, because it had been absent long enough that she'd almost stopped recognizing it. She felt at home. Not at home in the sense of comfortable or familiar. She'd been familiar with this land for 27 years. At home in the sense of being exactly where you belong, with the people who belong with you, doing the work that is actually yours. The specific, irreplaceable feeling of a life that fits. The evening before Christmas, Nathan came and found her at her father's desk, where she'd been working on the spring breeding schedule. "Come outside," he said. "I'm working," she said. "The work will be there in 10 minutes," he said. "Come outside." She came outside. The night was clear and very cold, and the stars over Wyoming were the way they got in deep winter. Close and brilliant, and so numerous they seemed less like individual stars than like the sky revealing its actual nature. The ranch was quiet. The horses were in. The hands had gone to the bunkhouse hours ago. Nathan stood beside her, and they looked at the sky for a while. "I sent word to Colorado," he said, "about the survey job." "I know," Clara said. "You told me you declined it." "I did," he said. "I wanted to tell you I declined the one after it as well." She looked at him. "I was offered a land survey position in New Mexico in February," he said. "Good work, good money. The kind of thing I would have taken without a second thought 8 months ago." He looked at her steadily. "I declined." "Because of the foreman position," Clara said. "Because of both things," Nathan said. "In whatever order you prefer." "Which you said." I said that in October," Clara said. "I've been thinking about it since October," he said. Clara looked at him. At this man who had come to buy a horse and stayed for something he hadn't known he was looking for, and who had stood beside her through the hardest weeks of her adult life, with a steadiness she had never found in anyone else, and who was now standing in the cold on Christmas Eve, telling her he'd declined work in 2 territories, and was doing it without flourish or performance, just with the plain, honest simplicity of someone reporting a fact they believe the other person deserves to know. She had been careful so long. She had been strategic so long. She had kept everything at the right distance, at the managed angle, in the safe holding position of a person who cannot afford to lose their footing. But her feet were on her own ground now. "Nathan Cole," she said, "you came here for a horse." "I did," he said. "You stayed for a month." "I did." "You declined work in 2 territories." "I did." "You fixed the south barn latch in 20 minutes." He almost smiled. "I did." "And you have been cataloging my faces," she said. 17, he said. "Though I suspect I've missed some." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, and without any of the careful management that had governed the last 7 years of her life, I'm glad you came for the horse. Nathan looked at her. So am I, he said. He reached up and touched her face with one hand. Gently, the way a person touches something they've been careful around for a long time and have finally been given permission to stop being careful about. And Clara leaned into it, which surprised her by feeling completely natural, like a thing she'd been about to do for months and had simply been waiting for the right moment. They stood there in the cold for a while. Just that. Then Clara said, "You should know that I am not an easy person." "I know that," Nathan said. "I am particular about the horses and the accounts and the way the barn is organized and the order in which the pastures are rotated," she said. "I've noticed," he said. "And I will not be managed," she said, "by anyone, ever again." "I wouldn't dream of it," Nathan said, and the way he said it made clear that he meant it completely, and also found it, quietly and respectfully, somewhat funny that she felt the need to say it out loud. "Good," Clara said. They went inside. Spring came to the Bennett Ranch, the way spring always came to Wyoming. Grudgingly at first, then all at once, the cold releasing its grip on the land over a period of weeks, before suddenly stepping back and letting the warmth through, as if it had only been a matter of deciding to. The pastures came in green and strong. The breeding program Clara had redesigned over the winter produced its first results. 5 healthy foals by April. 2 of them from the sorrel she'd almost sold to Nathan on the first morning. She had not, ultimately, sold him the sorrel. She had explained to Nathan that the horse was too valuable to the breeding program to sell, and that she would be happy to find him a comparable working horse from the other stock. And Nathan had said that was fine, and had taken a steady gray gelding instead, and had never once pointed out that the sorrel was, in any conventional sense, simply a horse. He understood. He always understood. Samuel Whitaker came to the ranch in May with papers that formalized the last elements of the legal restoration. He sat at the kitchen table and went through everything with the methodical care he brought to all things, and Clara signed where she was asked to sign. And when it was done, Whitaker looked at her across the table with something that was, in his restrained and professional way, almost warm. "I've practiced law for 23 years, he said. "I have never seen a case built the way you built this one. The documentation, the patience, the precision of it." He paused. "Your father taught you well." "He did," Clara said. "The Crane case should be heard in September," Whitaker said. "The Holt estate is more complicated, but we're making progress." He picked up his hat. "The Caldwell trial is set for November. Your testimony may be requested." "It'll be given," Clara said. Whitaker nodded once, which was his version of a great deal. On the morning of Whitaker's visit, before he arrived, Clara had done something she'd been planning for several weeks. She had gone to the general store in Harlan and bought a tin of good paint, the same green her father had always used, and she had come back to the ranch and repainted the name on the gate. Bennett. The same name, the same gate. But her hand this time, her choice, her declaration. Nathan had watched her do it without saying anything. When she finished and stepped back, he stood beside her and looked at it. "Looks right," he said. "It always did," Clara said. "Now it just means what it's supposed to mean." She handed him the paint tin and the brush, and he carried them back to the barn for her, and she stood at the gate for one more moment and looked at her father's name in her hand's paint, and felt the thing she had been building toward for 7 years settle finally into its completed shape. Not a fight anymore. Not a waiting. Not a careful, calculated survival. A life. Hers. In September, Clara Bennett stood before the Harlan County Fair's horse exhibition and accepted a blue ribbon for the best quarter horse bred in Wyoming territory that year. A sorrel colt from the spring foaling, built exactly like his father, with the same calm intelligence and the same strong bone and the same easy temperament that Clara had spent years developing in the Bennett line. The man who presented the ribbon was the same county official who had, 7 years ago, signed off on the property transfer without a second question. He called her Miss Bennett. He smiled when he said it. Clara accepted the ribbon with a steady hand and a steady face, and she thanked him with the same even courtesy she brought to everything, and she did not point out what they both knew, that the last time they'd been in the same room, she'd been 20 years old, and she'd lost. She didn't need to point it out. The ribbon said it clearly enough. Nathan was waiting at the fence when she walked back from the exhibition floor. He had his hat in his hands and the expression he wore when he was proud of something and was being judicious about showing it. "Well done," he said. "It's a good horse," Clara said. "It's an exceptional horse," he said. "Like everything you raise." She handed him the ribbon, and he held it and looked at it and then looked at her. "Do you ever—" he started. "No," she said. He blinked. "I hadn't finished." "You were going to ask if I ever think about how different it might have been," she said. "If someone had come sooner, if the judge had ruled differently, if Walter hadn't done what he did." Nathan was quiet. "And the answer is no," Clara said. "Not anymore. Those 7 years made me exactly who I needed to be to win. They made the records. They made the patience. They made the kind of woman who knows how to build a case and hold it together and wait for the right moment." She looked at him. "I wouldn't trade them." He looked at her for a long moment. "Even the hard parts?" he said quietly. "Especially the hard parts," she said. He nodded slowly, the way he did when something she said landed in him and he was giving it room. Then he put his hat back on and offered her his arm, and they walked together through the September fair with the Wyoming sun overhead and the blue ribbon in her hand and the Bennett Ranch waiting for them at the end of the road home. The cowboy had not changed Clara Bennett's fate. He had arrived at the exact moment she had finished building the tools to change it herself, and he had stood beside her while she used them, and that specific, irreplaceable human thing was worth everything. Clara Bennett had always been strong enough. She had simply, finally, been seen.